All right, welcome back, everyone. I have the honor of introducing a good friend, Patrick, who is also the board president of Simply Neuroscience and one of the conveners of the November Convention. So today, Patrick is going to be telling y'all a little bit more about best practices for computational reproducibility, that's a long word, in Python. But first, I want to introduce Patrick and give you a little bit more context about his background. So he is a statistical neuroscientist, an adjunct faculty member at NYU, and a philosopher of science, holds a bachelor's in neuroscience and digital and computational studies from Bowdoin, and is currently working towards a PhD at Boston University, which is in, spoiler alert, Boston, in computational neuroscience as an NSF-funded grad fellow. He teaches specifically at NYU, Foundations in Cognitive Science, and neuroscience work more broadly focuses on developing probabilistic and statistical methods for modeling neural time series across emergent spatial scales, and currently is using filtered point processes to model and explain biomarkers of propofol anesthesia induced unconsciousness in humans and monkeys as well. So let me pass the mic over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. What a long intro. That's wild. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. Super excited to be here. So as was just mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about this idea of reproducibility in scientific computing. The reason I said in Python is because at the end we're going to be going over some basic sort of case studies and sort of iterating over our code. And that's going to be in Python. But most of what I'm going to be talking about today is this high level idea of reproducibility that should apply in any language that you're going to be engaging with. And in fact, while I am thinking about this in terms of neuroscience and psychology, just because of where we are, you'll find that they'll be helpful in other fields as well. So a little bit of context for my background. I won't sort of redo the intro that we were just talking about. But I will say that while sort of I'm employed as a scientist and I teach science, the vast majority of what I spend my time thinking about are these problems of how do we structure code in a way that convinces not only researchers that the effects that they're interested in are real, but also how we can communicate that to broader populations that we're trying to engage with. And so a lot of my work at NYU in particular is developing tools that allow high schoolers and undergraduates to learn core skills in data visualization, and interpretability of their analyses, and then communication of the results to broader stakeholders. And one other thing I'll mention about that work there is we develop AI-enabled tools to help support that work. And so while there's sort of a lot of energy in the field around like using AI and like automating things and things along those lines, what I'm going to be talking about here are core skills that are not made irrelevant by things like AI, or offloading your coding to things like GitHub Copilot or things along those lines. So these are core principles that we should be thinking about all the time, and we can always add more tools. But it's something that is sort of core to being a researcher in general. The last thing I always have to say, a disclaimer. So I'm funded by two agencies. One is the National Institutes of Health, and I'm a National Science Foundation graduate fellow at the NSF. So appreciate their funding, but I'm here in a personal capacity to just talk about scientific reproducibility. The other thing that I want to flag here, the purpose of this workshop is not to teach you how to code in Python, and it's not even to teach you how to code in the domain of neuroscience or psychology. So there are a ton of wonderful resources everywhere, three of which I've just put up here, one being case studies in neural data analysis, a guide to open science for psychologists and statistical thinking in the 21st century. The authors here are primarily Mark Kramer and Ori Eden, who are two statisticians based in Boston who kind of live in the Boston University, MIT, and Mass General Hospital universe. this is a wonderful example because not only does it teach you how to code in Python, but also sort of it gives you access to real neuroscience data that you would expect to see from a lot of different recording modalities. So it might be neuronal spiking data, it might be like EEG data, and it sort of gives you a lot of the foundations for the types of plots and analyses that you would expect to have, as well as explaining the math in a pretty accessible way. So highly recommend that. And then another researcher I've been fascinated with in recent years is Russ Poldrick, who's at Stanford currently, and he's done a lot of really wonderful work in thinking about introducing these ideas of open science and statistical thinking in a really accessible way to psychologists more generally. And so he has a full textbook, which is available in print to buy, but is also free on his GitHub that you can go and check out. And then also he has this wonderful resource here, which kind of goes through some of the basic things that I won't be talking about here, but it would be relevant to researchers in general. So things like pre-registration, data sharing, best practices, reproducible manuscripts, and things along those lines. So if I'm not going to be teaching you how to code today, like what exactly are we going to be talking about, or maybe what the problem is? So this is just an introduction to thinking about issues of reproducibility, in particular, convincing you that there is an issue. And in fact, it's much deeper than folks will often appreciate. And then I'm going to be giving us a way out, at least a basic structure of a way out. So I'm going to be introducing what's called the tier framework for thinking about how do we, at the start of our project, structure our file systems in code before we even do anything to set us up for success in the long run. And then I'm going to be introducing us to three basic tools that are going to be useful for sort of achieving different levels of reproducibility and collaboration as our projects grow and sort of change over time. And then at the end, I'm going to be giving us several examples of sort of readable and effective code iteration. So I'm going to be walking us through that, and then I'll leave some time at the end for general questions. So maybe one way I can motivate the problem here is through something we've all probably heard of. It's this idea of a reproducibility crisis. And so this is sort of the classic survey results from 2016, where Nature, which is a large publishing house for scientific journals, reached out to a whole bunch of scientists across different disciplines. And they basically asked people like, one, have you ever failed to reproduce someone else's experiment? And have you ever failed to reproduce your own experiment? And then two, do you believe that there's a replicability crisis? And so in general, the vast majority of researchers that were polled not only believe that in general there's a replicability crisis, but they've had difficulty in reproducing their own experiments and the experiments of others. And there are a lot of different reasons why people believe this is the case. Sometimes, it could just be the most negative possibility where, some people are either like fabricating data or misinterpreting the results or something along those lines. But more often than not, it's much more boring than that, where, for example, people have made either a mistake in their calculations, they had underpowered study designs, there are sort of strict conditions at which you would expect it to replicate, but if you deviate from those, you might not be able to recreate it. Or, as we'll sort of be hinting at today, the actual structure of code or their experimental protocols are not clear enough to be able to actually reproduce what folks are after. And so as we sort of go throughout the rest of this, I want to make one distinction here that I think often people will fail to make, and it's the difference between reproducibility and replicability in science. So reproducibility, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, is this idea that if you use the exact same procedures, so think about statistical procedures, you have this access to the same data, and you use the same code, you should get the same result. And that seems like a trivial idea, but I'll try to convince you in just a second that in fact most studies, both in industry and in academia, don't meet that requirement. And then the broader one that folks are usually more concerned about is this idea of replicability, which is if you use the same procedures, but you collect new data and say like implement your own code, you should be able to get the same result. And so a lot of the headlines in, newspapers or scientific journals that talk about the replicability crisis, or even sometimes the reproducibility crisis, they have this second one in mind where, the effect itself that they're concerned about may or may not replicate. But what we're talking about is this much more fundamental one where if we have a situation where we have all the information and we would expect to get the same result, we in fact don't get the same result. So um, the other thing I'll quickly mention with this is there are different definitions of what people care about for reproducibility. So the bottom one is maybe the most strict, where you would expect that bit by bit for the actual data that you are storing and analyzing and things along those lines, everything should be identical between runs. And I would suggest that that's maybe too strict because that would include things like metadata as well as all the contents, say like data files, code, plots, and things along those lines. And why I would think that's too strict is one example for how we would fail to reproduce something is if you run it on one day and I run it on a later day, we would get different results because in the metadata, for example, it might store the information for like the timestamp on your computer, right? So not all levels of perfect reproducibility are something that we might care about, but we would expect, say, for example, at the level of our data or the level of statistics, that we would hope that we would get the same result. So just keep in mind that there are different definitions people might have in mind, and always being the most strict in terms of how we think about reproducibility might not be the most productive. Great. So I've set up this sort of like intuitive idea where if we have all the data, all the code, we would expect we would get the same result. And it turns out a whole host of research has suggested when you look at the literature and you try to do that, they often fail to do so. So in this case, this is from 2 years ago now, where a group of researchers looked at 9,000 different studies and publicly available scripts with publicly available data, which is already its own sort of subset of unique instances of research, since most studies still don't make their data fully publicly available and don't make their code fully publicly available. But for the folks who do, they found that 74% of the tested files failed to compile when they tried to run it the first time, right? And it turns out that even if you did put in a little elbow grease and you try to clean up the code, so fixing various directories or different functions or different versions of the code you're trying to use, it turns out that 56% of them still failed. And so the idea here is that even if you have access to everything that you should have to be able to reproduce a given result found in a paper, the majority of the time it's not sufficient because either the data was stored in a confusing way or the code itself is set up in a way that doesn't scale in time. And this is reinforced by another example. This was a famous one from a couple of years ago where there was a challenge that was put out to scientists where they asked, does your 10-year-old code still run? So when we think about the work that we do as scientists, right, we would expect that our results are supposed to stand up to scrutiny, at least, on the scale of 10 years, or at least maybe like 5 years out. And it turns out that many folks who will go back at older projects and maybe they want to reuse code or reanalyze data often can't. And sort of the name of the game for why they can't do that is, one, they are not documenting their data and their code well. And two, they are not sort of having any protocols in their lab to control the environment at which they're running their code or in which they're analyzing their data. And so this matters because we want to be able to be more efficient in how we generate new science, right? So often when someone is introducing a new analysis or a new technique or a new data set, it's not just going to be sitting in that one paper and then we never return to it. But often labs will have multiple people cycle through who will be working with a particular code base. And if we are able to manage our environments effectively and then document it well, folks don't have to spend, a year plus trying to understand what something is doing, try to understand the math behind it. They can just jump right in and then try to do something new and more interesting from there. We also should be able to reanalyze work, right? So oftentimes data sets are extremely expensive to engage with or collect rather. And so we want to be able to engage with them for a long period of time after. One example, just from my own life, it was mentioned earlier that I study propofol anesthesia, and I think there's like a number of like on the order of like 20 or 25 papers that have come out of one data set from MGH because of how expensive it was in studying, um, uh, propofol in humans and like how we monitor different brain states. And it was oftentimes when it was when we were first starting, it was very difficult to sort of get that data up and running because it wasn't sort of documented as well as we were hoping it would be. And so folks spent a lot of time in trying to make it super clear to people, like what's actually in the data, how do you access it, what analyses have been done before, so that new work can come out of that data. And then finally, one that often isn't appreciated enough at the level of scientists, but something that I value a lot. Anyone should be able to work with your code and your data and be able to sort of engage with it to see if it holds up to scrutiny. And so there's a movement in sort of reproducible science where you should be able to reproduce all the figures in someone's paper with one click. So you don't need to set up an environment, download Python on your local computer, all of these different things. You should just be able to hit one button and reproduce everything from there. So if that's the goal, how do we sort of get there? And the first one is to understand that reproducibility is a spectrum, and it's something that also is not sort of static in time. So I always think this framing is pretty funny, but the incentive structures in industry and academia are that when you do research, the final product is the paper. And so people will think about like rigorous writing in their paper, making sure their papers are really clear, having beautiful figures and things along those lines. But from a reproducible computing perspective, that is on the level of advertising. So you're basically saying like all the work is done. You're just giving people the sound bites, right? Because all the work that you do over the course of your time doing the research isn't actually in the paper. It's just the sort of most important thing that the reader needs to know. They can sort of get the results only, get a sense through like any equations or explanations of like how you came to those results, and then they can decide whether or not to sort of pay attention to the paper, right? And so like as we realize that maybe we don't want just static papers to be the only feature of our science, but we want it to be more lively than that. There's been initiatives of saying, well, people should be able to access your data so that they can implement the methods that you described in your paper. As tools were built and data storage became easier, internet became faster, folks realized that we should also be showing our code for how we interacted with the data to reproduce things in the text. And finally, up here with version control, we realized that as coding environments change, as languages change, as people keep iterating on their techniques, we want to be able to look at different versions in time for how we've engaged with our analyses in the past. And so we always want to try to lean towards this way, where real science is not only just the text that we provide people and our interpretations of it, but we want them to be able to go in and actually engage with the code themselves, engage with the data themselves. We want to allow folks to share it if possible. Sometimes that's not reasonable just because of protections of research participants, but in many cases we would want to allow people to repurpose data and use it for other areas of science. So just know that the goal is to kind of move beyond just the paper and move beyond just improving the outputs in a paper, but make it something much more lively. So kind of rang for a little bit about this idea of there is a problem, we should want to do better, but I want to give us a little bit of time to think about how can we actually do better. So what is an effectively structured project? And there are many different frameworks for how to think about structuring a project, from data collection to organizing our code and analyses and so forth. The one that I like the most for an intro level audience is this idea of the tier protocol. So the tier protocol is basically something that was created to help us organize the contents of our project, from like the level of data to our statistical analyses, to sort of just like actual communicating the actual file structure. And I'm gonna actually pull up tier here in a second. But even though when you go to the website, and I'll show us that in a second, there are like a million different pages to read and a million different tabs to go through, it is basically exactly what you would expect a well-structured project to contain. It's basically saying we can break the whole project down into a couple of predetermined directories or file structures, so that it's easy to navigate. And so you have your data, your documentation, your analyses, and then your command files. And within your original data, we have the files that basically, ideally, would come right off of whatever measurement technique you're doing. So it would be, the outputs of where your survey data is coming from. It would be the actual like electrophysiological recording files from your hardware. And then you have a guide for people to understand like what is actually in the data file. So how do they navigate it? What do all the variables mean? And sort of introducing it in a way that a informed but maybe non-hyper expert can navigate. To help support that, you can have documentations here, and you'll notice that one of them is the actual final paper. So this might be the actual research paper itself, and people should be able to get an open access version of that. But also having documentation that in clear language, without requiring people to navigate through everything, can tell people what is actually in the data, and then maybe having a summary of it in the classic like README file, so to speak. Um, it's not enough to just have the final paper and the data. So we also want to have analysis files, so that you can sort of communicate at different stages of the analysis. So say pre-processing or something along those lines, where people can sort of track the life cycle of the data, and arrive at the same conclusions that you are suggesting are true. So we can have a different file structure for that. And then finally, we have sort of our command files. And these are not only files to sort of run certain parts of the code, like oftentimes people will do, but also sort of one master file that allows us to run everything that we would expect to see in the final paper. And we'll sort of come back to that in a second. So I'm going to bring this out, come over to our tier protocol. And so this is the website that I had in mind. And it gives you, there's a whole bunch of different helpful things on here. So they have a bunch of like curricula that they've developed. They have events to train folks on effective project management using this protocol. They have various initiatives that you can kind of keep an eye on from there. But this is sort of the bread and butter of it here, where we have one overall directory, which they're just calling project here. And then they have the actual structure that you can go from there. The idea here is you would create these files before you actually start doing anything. So it allows you to have an idea of a structure that you should fit into before you start collecting data. It can help you think about like what information do I need to record in my data? So not only like the actual files themselves, but how do I come up with a guide when I'm collecting data, and then organizing it and storing it after each session of collecting, so that you can stay organized and put it directly into that file as you go along. And then there's this idea of code books where, if you have certain variables that are meaningful to you, but not meaningful to anyone else, you can use it as sort of a cheat sheet to communicate, like, this is the essential information that you need to take away from. And obviously, I won't sort of walk you through each one of these, but I really encourage you to kind of go through here and click through each of these documents, because it will actually explain, how you should think about each of these levels. The other one that I do want to point out, though, is this one down here, this idea of this master script. So oftentimes when people make their code accessible and they're doing research, they'll have these three files where it'll be like, oh, this is how I pre-processed the data and loaded it in. Maybe if I had any, extra figures in the appendix of my paper, I can pop these right here. These are our main analysis scripts. And then it's on the user to figure out, like, how do these functions relate to each other? Which ones run first? Do I even need some of these to recreate the figures? And there was a push a couple years ago where folks would, maybe have some demo scripts where you can actually like engage or explore with a couple of the functions, and that's great. But we want to make things as easy as possible. So the easiest way to do that is have one master script. It tells you what it does. For example, it could run all 5 figures if you have 5 figures in your paper. And you can just allow people to either like hit run or, change the file path on their own computer. And then after that change, it's able to do that without an issue. So that's kind of a goal that we should have. Now, if we scroll down here, I want to kind of use this as an opportunity to talk about some of the standards of reproducibility that are just inherent in what I'm arguing for and what the tier protocol is arguing for. So this one is at the heart of reproducibility, where sufficiency is basically saying that everything someone needs to do anything that you are suggesting is important in your work needs to be accessible to them, and they should be able to play around with it, right? And I think like we have a ton of different frameworks for that. It doesn't have to be the tier protocol, but we do want to make it easy for people to navigate. And I think that the easiest way to enable that is to have one centralized approach for thinking about project management, at least at a fundamental level, so that people aren't sort of guessing as you move into new contexts how or where I should be looking for things. This one, so I'm going to skip over the soup to nuts one. So the portability one is something that I think especially a lot of more seasoned scientists think is overkill, because they will make the argument that anyone who has training in the field should be able to look at what you do and with a little effort understand what you're doing, and then recreate it on their own machine. And I think what I'll suggest here is fields are far too complicated and large now for that to be a reasonable assumption. So in neuroscience, for example, most people aren't a biologist, right? And we think about it coming from biology, but a lot of people come from physics, a lot of people come from pharmacology, a lot of people come from chemistry, some people are strictly computer scientists. And those folks will all contribute really important insights into the field and methods to the field, and we shouldn't expect the onus to be on someone engaging with your work to have all the domain knowledge that you do, for them to accurately be able to engage with your work. So the idea is we should be able to have our code and our projects in general be portable, so that you can do it directly on your computer with as little work as possible, which leads into this last one that I already mentioned, where it should basically be one-click reproducible, where all the computations required to generate the results of a study should require almost nothing other than, say, like finding the master script and running it. And I'll show you some tools that make it literally one click in just a little bit. So highly consider you take the time going to the tier protocol, reading a little bit about it. A lot of exciting work going on there. But I want to have like the TLDR for the organization tips, and this is both for your data and your code structuring. So keep everything in one folder for your project. So we do a lot of different projects in our career. If you're a PhD student, usually you'll have like 2 or 3 aims, right? Have 3 different folders and you can keep everything in there. And if you have these predetermined locations for different styles of things, so like separate data folders, code folders, result folders, it's going to make it much easier for you, not only to like when you have to end up publishing, but also just for keeping track of things. If you find a lot of stuff that doesn't fit into, or you create a lot of things that don't fit into those um, folders, it's maybe a good indication that you should ask, like, is this part of a different project? Is it something that, I haven't clearly sort of defined, or are there too many things in one file that should be broken down into multiple files? So it's also a good heuristic for sort of thinking through what you're actually doing. This goes without saying, somewhere your raw file or raw data needs to be there unaltered without any pre-processing, and ideally you can make that accessible. So for the empirical scientists in the room, there's a huge push now where it's sufficient for you to just collect a huge, really interesting data set and then publish just the data set. And then the idea is that people like me will come in and sort of iterate on the data and try to find more interesting results from the work that you've already done. This is this idea of like large collaborative science. And if the data isn't available when it's raw and there's a lot of pre-processing done on it, that limits the value of your data because you're sort of making assumptions that, for example, someone who's interested in a different question than you might not want to make. So making sure that that's accessible and available, and also at the very least saved somewhere locally, and then keep exact track of the versions that you're engaging with to make a particular claim, right? So if you pre-process it in a particular way and you then run your analyses after a certain step, make sure you communicate or note that somewhere. And I think finally, this is one that a lot of folks struggle with, and sometimes I struggle with too. A lot of my students, I will look at their files and they'll have like untitled document, like 1 through 3,000, and they can track it based off of like either the number or when they last engaged with it. That's not a good idea. So try to come up with a naming convention that is obvious to not only your reader, but obviously obvious to you, where you can have a sense of what is in the file, when was it created, and things along those lines. And try to think about it in scalability, right? So sometimes people will slap the date in the name of their file, and that can be fine. But if you get 3 years on, you're not going to remember, which was the right version when it was July 17th versus like July 27th for your code. So trying to think about meaningful naming conventions that you can look back to and have a sense of what's in it before you spend the time to actually look through it. Great. So the next sort of thing that I'll sort of build off of from the tier protocol is this idea of the open science framework. So the OSF has a ton of functionalities, from pre-registration to conducting research to helping people plan their projects and things along those lines. So I don't want to suggest that this is only for reproducible computing. But it's sort of a way of centrally storing all of the things that we were just talking about. So oftentimes you'll see someone publish a paper and then there'll be a link somewhere to say, oh, you can find all of the files and data and whatnot on the open science framework. And I want to show a brief example. This is just a demo of it. In particular, I want to show the README file and kind of show you the standard that we should be shooting for. So up here, you have a bunch of different things that you can navigate. I can put the actual example in the chat for people to explore on their own. There's many examples of these. This is just one from Duke University using the tier system, but this README is the level of clarity that I think that we should shoot for as a scientific community, where you start with saying, like, where is it coming from? Like, what are the relevant citations for people to come to reference if they need it? But then most importantly, this list, which is basically telling people everything, like down to like the HTML, like terms of use file that they can find in your project or that's required for them to engage with your project. And so, under like the documents folder, for example, you'll have like multiple PDFs, and it'll be the exact name. And if there's anything else in there, it has to be added to this list. Same thing with like the original data. So in this case, they just have text files and things along those lines. But having it be there so people can work through and then have your raw data file up here, it allows you to communicate that, exactly what their expectation should be for what data is important, and then what is the supporting information to try to go through that data set and so forth. So you can see this for each of the different things we were talking about. And then you can also communicate like what graphs should be able to be reproduced based off of the things that you're providing them. So Open Science Framework is something you should definitely look into. And in fact, there's a partnership between TIER and OSF. So it's very common for folks to at least try to use the OSF to implement the TIER program and manage the project at every stage of their research. The last one that I want to quickly show for at least this idea of using the tier protocol is that the OSF framework is really great, but it's sort of frozen in a way of like, you have everything well structured on your computer, and then instead of just having it on your computer, you're making it accessible for other people to engage with. But we can actually make it more lively, where we can truly do the one-click reproducibility. And there are a whole bunch of capsules on this platform. So the platform is called Code Ocean. And you can basically have all of the file structures we were just talking about with the structure we were suggesting is important with tier, or you can iterate it on a little bit. And this software can auto test all of your scripts to make sure that it's sort of up to snuff, so to speak. And in fact, there is a literal button on the side. It's called a reproducible run. I'm not going to do it because it's 2 minutes here, but basically at any time, someone can come onto your project. They can click this button. It will test all of the files to make sure they're still current as of today, and our current capabilities. And it will publish all the results that you are communicating that your code can do. So for example, if I wanted to get this plot from this particular paper, you can click this button, it'll show you what code is generating the plot, and then it will finally do the plot here. And it gets this for every single plot in the paper. And if there's versions, you can check out how it holds up over multiple versions. If someone finds an error in the code and you go in and correct it, it will do the full thing again, generate a new plot, and you can see how the results would change now that they found the error or something along those lines. So in my opinion, this is like the most important level of reproducibility, where we can be fully transparent. We don't have to worry about making mistakes, because if we ever do find that we made a mistake or we change something in our code after getting more information, we don't have to wonder how our results would change or how the interpretation would change. We can just constantly in a live way update our information so that we don't have to waste all of that time and energy just sort of wondering whether a paper should be paid attention to or not. So definitely play around with this on your own. It's free. There are very like large paid versions of it. So large institutes like the Allen Institute, which is a huge systems neuroscience initiative, has a partnership with them. A lot of pharma companies and biotech companies use this as their default, but there's also an academia version of it. So, if you're in a lab right now or you're interested in sort of playing around with this tool, I highly recommend you make a free account and start engaging with that from there. So the last thing I want to quickly talk about, I'll go full screen again, is everything I've communicated so far in theory can be done on your own. So like as one person who's developing code, running analysis, collecting data, and then communicating results. And folks are probably the most familiar with this. But what happens if I have collaborators? We've known from sort of industry experience and academia experience that it doesn't make sense to have one hard and fast centralized repository that everyone is sort of dipping into at the same time, because that's how things break, that's how things get deleted. Quite a while ago, people have pitched what's called like a decentralized or distributed project management or code management versioning tool. And the most famous one is GitHub. Um, Basically, what this allows you to do is you have one centralized place, as we originally started with, but you can branch off of it and sort of have your own individual repositories that you can update and make changes to, and then eventually you can merge back into the final. So the idea here is like people can create their own sort of sandbox code bases that you can play around with, try to add new features, debug on your own without impacting the workflow of other people. And a lot of labs get away with not using this just because they're smaller. But as we move to places where, one, we want collaborators over time, so other labs might be interested in your code, as we suggested earlier. We want to make it so people can check out the versions of that and contribute to it. But also, as labs themselves get larger, we want to be able to have people who don't have to wait for their peers to contribute to projects. So this is sort of the basic like GitHub framework, where you might have a master branch and you can create a branch for either different users or different feature development or things along those lines. And you can, introduce new code to it, commit those changes, run tests on those, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then if everything works well, we can merge it back to the final master branch. And you can sort of imagine this expanded for as many developers over as much time as is required. And it works relatively well. Now, I will say it's important to not just sort of get a basic crash course on this. There's a lot of really wonderful introductions and free boot camps on YouTube. One that I would recommend, going to come out of this, one that I would recommend is Data Camp, which many people have probably heard from. So this is a great GitHub and Git tutorial for beginners, and it kind of walks through the whole intuition of branches, commits, what's the benefit of it, which I just kind of hand waved at. But then it goes all the way down to, actually introducing the basic commands, which Git itself is a language, or technically it's not, but you can think of it as a language. So it sort of introduces all the important skills that you'll need to do to engage with GitHub. It teaches you how to install GitHub in your local machine, and things along those lines. So I highly recommend this as the basic one. And then we can iterate from there to get more advanced as we get more comfortable with it. Great. So what I'm going to do now is I want to quickly give us a brief introduction to this thing that I've been gesturing at broadly. It's this idea of like, what does good code look like? So if we're comfortable with the idea that we should structure our projects well, people should be able to engage with our data, engage with our code in a live way through things like CodeOcean or the Open Science Framework. We want to have code that's worth engaging with, basically. And I've created one sort of basic function or snippet of code. And what I kind of want to show you here in our last couple of minutes is how do we iterate on improving this to make it clearer to our users and to ourselves what we're actually doing. And so the most basic example is, say we wanted to create a function that just adds two numbers together, right? So something that we don't really need to be experts in Python to understand, 2 + 2 = 4, and we just want to be able to automate it where if we give any two numbers to the function, we'll get a sum out of it. So, in the simplest way, we can think about this as just saying, oh, we can take two variables, x and y, and we want to return, the sum of those from there. This has a lot of issues with it because, one, there's no guidance on like what the function does. There's no safeguards in terms of how people interact with the function. It doesn't sort of tell people what they're expected to get out of the function. Yeah, basically there's too many ways that this could break. So one that we've probably heard about before, one way to improve this in a basic way that folks are probably familiar with is this idea of inline comments, which is basically where you use in Python this hashtag, or in MATLAB it would be like the %. You can add comments to basically write text that isn't executed by your computer, and you can just tell people, oh, this function will add two numbers together and it's going to return the result, right? And so that, I'm just going to run these real quick. That improves our intuition because we can at least have the expectation of this, generally adding things together, and we're going to get the sum out of it. The inline comment is just providing a hint here, though, and it's not actually providing like helpful documentation. And if we have much more complicated functions or projects with many, many different functions that are interacting with each other, we want to be able to give skills or information for people to accurately interact with the function in some way. So the most basic level of having sort of sufficient code is to have what are called doc strings. So every language has some version of a doc string. So in Python, in this case, it's just three sort of quotes here right after each other. And you can sort of look up the equivalent in your respective language. But this is sort of the best practice idea of how do we think about structuring your explanation of what a function does. So the first thing is just the description. This might be drawing on what we were already talking about, where it's like, add as a function, all it does is it adds two numbers together. You can assume that this is sufficient, right? Because it's not very complicated. But if you're using a function that does something that people don't have an intuition for, or is complex in its statistical formulation, you might want to put citations in. So like, where did you actually get the equation? So you're implementing this, like equation 32 from chapter 4 of this textbook. You can put the DOI of the textbook in there so people can actually find it. And you can sort of explain the different variables that are in there. And that sort of leads us to the second part here, where we have parameters, where you want to do the work for your user, where you assume that someone knows Python, they know the different data types in Python, but that they aren't just going to be able to look at your function and guess like what data format it should be in. So you can do the work here where you say, well, if I'm adding two numbers together, they should be in a particular format, either an integer or a float. For folks who are unfamiliar, an integer in Python is just a number without a decimal place, and a float is something that has a decimal place. So if I have 5, like it's present, or maybe 2 or 3 here, as it's presented here, this is an integer. As long as I put a decimal and then maybe put a 0 here, or even without a 0, that becomes a float. Python's smart enough now to iterate between those pretty clearly. But what we wouldn't want to have is, say, like a character or a word being put into this, because we would expect there to be an error return, because you can't add the two together. And then finally, you want to have something that tells people what's returned. So not only the data types of the inputs, but what they would expect out, either an int or a float, and it would be the sum of the two numbers. And then finally, you would put your code below that. So it's not just that people, when they go to this function in your code, they can read through that, but when they're sort of live coding, you get access to the help function here. In Python, every language has some version of this, either say like putting a question mark or 2 question marks. And so in this case, right, I have to rerun this one. What we get access to is when I say help and I want to engage with that function, even if this isn't a software package, right, I can access the documentation anywhere else as long as I can access this function up here. So it's really helpful to have, even though the output itself, right, we haven't added any functionality, we're just adding clarity. We can improve this further still, right, where we want to give help not just to the user, but we want to give help to the language and environment we're engaging with, and we can use type annotations. I really often don't find this in a lot of people's code. So people tend to do really well with the documentation up here, or at least after they have it introduced, they do really well. But you can have annotations here where you can tell your environment what you're expecting the data type to actually be. So in this case, right, if we wanted them to be floats, you can put or expand your function a little bit to say like x colon and then float, and we would expect to get out a float. And it's a little bit harder to read, but what that allows us to do is when there's an error here, it allows for the language to guess at what actually the issue is, even if you didn't come up with sort of a correct error handling approach. So here up top, right, I'm adding two numbers together and I expect 5.6. That's exactly what I'm getting. But if we're down here and I'm adding what in this case is called a string, or like say like words, and I'm trying to add that to a number, it's not just going to give me a generic error. It's going to allow the software to know that it's not behaving the way that we would expect it to. So this basically makes types more self-explanatory for how your function should be engaging with code you're passing to it. We can do better still by sort of having not only a comprehensive docstring, but also deal with edge cases. And I could do a whole lecture on error handling here, but basically we want to sort of anticipate things that could go wrong. So like we were just mentioning, someone who tries to pass a word and a number into our function, which it doesn't make any sense to add words and numbers. And we can just sort of preemptively write code that allows us to prevent that from happening and then tell the user how to behave. So in this case, right, we can add raises, which is usually short for like type error raises. And it will tell people like what are expected things that could go wrong with this, and what do we mean by sort of the error that they get out of it. And we can write some code, which I'm not going to walk through here, but we can make use of what's already built in Python to engage with those errors. And so that when we see those things before, actually I have to rerun this one here. When we see those things before, instead of just getting a scary error message that is not interpretable and people might shut down when they see it, we can tell them exactly what the issue is here. So, both X and Y must be numbers. And we would probably expand this a little bit further and say that at least one of them is not an integer or a float. So you have to kind of go back in and iterate on that. The last one that I want to briefly talk about is these are all sort of like traditional ways of error handling, documenting things so people can interpret or read your code, know what to look for, and things along those lines. But we also want to have this level of testing where testing has multiple functions. One, it convinces you that the code is doing what you expect it to do. But number two, it convinces everyone else that the code you have written does what you are saying it does. And so in this case, it's easy to think of what tests might look like, but it's probably the most difficult part of coding in today's day and age, where things like ChatGPT or like Claude don't do well writing tests. Because they sort of require a higher level of thinking or abstraction, where you need to know how all the different features of your code interact, and you need to have ideas about like what the output actually is. So if you're doing a semi-complicated computation, you need to think of use cases for like what the output should actually be given some initial parameters. And there's been a lot of really interesting research lately where things like ChatGPT can write code really well, but not anticipate how it should work or like how it should interact with different parameter sets. So the basic idea of writing a function is you come up with cases for how someone might interact with your function. So in this case, adding two positive numbers, adding two negative numbers, or adding a positive and a negative and trying to get an output from it, or coming up with examples of errors that might be raised. And you just define functions that would explicitly assert that something must be true. and you're basically testing whether or not when you put in those two inputs into your function, whether you get the output that you're expecting. Now, here, just for clarity, I'm putting this in this document, but oftentimes you'll have your own file set for tests that you then sort of run in an external environment. I've kind of done some work here to cheat a little bit and do it directly in the notebook. But the idea is when someone is going through and automatically engaging with your code, or something like CodeOcean is checking your code, it can run these tests for you, say like once every day or once every month or something along those lines. And it will read back out whether or not the thing that you say is supposed to be occurring is still happening as a function of time. So in this case, it's simple. It's just two numbers being added, but as Python changes and new functions are added or taken away, or different types of coding practices are removed from whatever Python versions people are using, you can test whether or not the code is still working as those changes are being made, even if you're not actively checking them. So this is just a high level introduction to how we think about going through and writing good code. You aren't going to sort of start with tests. Well, you can, but don't. The most efficient way of coding is considered not sort of doing test-driven development, but starting with writing code maybe at this level, convincing yourself that you have something that works, and then iterating through and constantly improving your code over time. So you shouldn't be having the expectation for yourself that you're going to write production level code right from the get-go, but rather know that every time you sit down, try to iterate or improve your code so that it's easier for you and other people to engage with over time. And then eventually you'll get to a point where you have these well-structured projects that you're starting with, but then you also have code that you can plug into there so you can make use of the structure that you've done all the work to sort of set up. So I'm coming up to my hour here, so I'll sort of pause there and see if there's any questions. If you have questions that we don't get answered here, you'd like to chat after, you can reach out to me over email or Twitter. I run much longer versions of this for free, over the course of a week. So I'm always happy to do that. And then if you have specific questions on your work, always happy to sort of check in and within reason, help you troubleshoot any issues you have. But with that, I just want to thank everyone for coming today, and appreciate folks just signing up for the convention in general. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. That was a really, really thorough walkthrough, and appreciate the introduction. And if anyone, maybe we can take a quick question or two. If anyone wants to drop something in the chat or unmute, raise a hand on Zoom, feel free to. No questions? Everything's all clear? In that case, let me drop a link to Patrick's website in chat. Oh, Bernie, yes, go ahead.
Hi, I was trying to remember how to raise my hand on Zoom, sorry. Do you have any advice for somebody who is absolutely terrified of coding? I still do it for my research projects. I just do it with a lot of fear. Do you have any advice for me?
Yeah, so I mean, I think like a couple levels to that. One is there's a ethos around coding of it being like really inaccessible and like highly technical and like doused in like mathematical and computational thinking. I think that it's totally false. Like, I think anyone can code. I don't think it takes a special person to be good at coding. I think like the vast majority of people who are like quote unquote good at coding, it's not because they can memorize all these things or don't have to look everything up, but like I have just seen so many errors in my code that I can like guess right, like what is probably needs to be fixed or something along those lines. So it's just one of those things where, as you go along, it's like a messy, often guess and check process. Um, it's like something that relative to like data collection or experimental design is far less structured in like what direction you should go in. There are different styles for what coding should look like, and so even though I've introduced some examples here and some frameworks for like the actual data man or the project management side of things, know that like you're going to have your own coding style, and the way that people have different writing styles, they're all acceptable. And people have weird strong opinions that don't actually matter about like the language you use and like how you like structure your functions, and things along those lines. Don't listen to them. There's no need to hand wring, like coding's for everyone. And in fact, like if we want to be better scientists, right, like I think that it's something that we should be incorporating at every level. Yeah, without sort of weeding out who should be a computational person and a non-computational person. So I guess that's the advice I would have, and then just continue to practice, and go to things like this, where you get insights into people's process. You can take what you like, don't take what you don't like, and just kind of build up your own identity as a coder.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm gonna remember that everybody can code.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, and like with the CS proofs, I will say, so like being primarily a mathematician, um, what makes a proof isn't being hyper technical. What makes a proof is that someone can recognize the thing you're saying is true. And so there are a lot of proofs that are highly technical in their structure that people can't recognize are true, and in fact, they end up being false. And so, while we do sort of have mathematical notation, to be rigorous and pick out exactly what we're talking about, and it's true in CS, and you see it in physics as well, right? You can only really get to that point if you understand the foundations of like how ideas relate to each other and how different features of our code matter, right? So if we're talking about scalability of our code, and like what our computational complexity is, those ideas only matter if we understand that like, hey, like the way we structure our code matters in terms of getting different results. So like for loops are going to be different from while loops, for example, or different data structures have inherent assumptions that make things slower. So if we don't have that first level of understanding, jumping all the way up to a proof, often, in my opinion, in CS departments, is like misleading in terms of what people should be picking out, right? And then there's also like, obviously having taught some of those proofs in those intro classes, I think I have to teach those things because people require me to, but oftentimes the things that are actually important don't matter. So oftentimes people are always after optimization, but if you are doing a problem that doesn't require optimization, it doesn't mean we should spend 2 months making something optimized when what you were doing is already just fine. What's more important is like, hey, this thing actually does what I say it does, and we should care about the results. But totally understand like, the pressure to like jump into the technical and be like an expert, and write these, very inaccessible proofs. Yeah.
Everyone could join me in a round of applause. Thank you, Patrick, for your time on the weekend. A busy person and a very busy schedule. So always appreciate these workshops, super helpful. Let me go back.